Now, as Natalia hands out the sermon notes that I've prepared for you this morning, I want you to think back just for a moment to last week's message. We said that the Sermon on the Mount raises a vital question, both for the people in the audience and for us. And we framed that question as, why should we trust Jesus? But what Matthew does for us in 8:1 through 17 is he reframes the question a different way. It's really the same question, but he's shaping it in a different way to help us understand why it is, in fact, that we should trust Jesus. But that's not all that Matthew does. He raises additional questions for us to consider. And those additional questions help us understand better who Jesus is and what He's about. So let's begin with that reframed question. Instead of asking, why should we trust Jesus? Matthew evokes in us the question, does Jesus have the authority He claims? Because, of course, what Matthew notes at the end of chapter 7 is that Jesus spoke with authority, not like the theologians of His day, the legal scholars, the scribes. He was speaking as if He had the right to offer a definitive interpretation of the law and the prophets. As if He Himself had the right to say how we should live. It's a big claim. Does He really have that kind of authority? Well, Matthew answers that reformulated question by showing us the authority that Jesus does have. And here we're going to concentrate mostly on the first story Natalia read and the last. We'll come to the middle one in a few moments. But what do we see? We see that Jesus has authority over disease. Now, that's significant in and of itself. But we'll see in a few moments that it may even have more significance than we imagine. Jesus has authority over ritual purity and impurity. Did you notice that when the man kneels before Jesus to place his request, which isn't really a request, it's a statement, but it functions as a request, he doesn't ask Jesus to heal him. He frames his request in terms of being cleansed, in terms of being set right with God and His community. He can fully participate now in the life, and especially the worshiping life, of His people. And then in the last story, after Peter's mother-in-law is healed, notice what happens. Jesus doesn't just heal diseases. He casts out demons. And He does so with just a word. echoing what the centurion says about Jesus in the middle story. Now, we could simply argue, well, okay, wow, if Jesus has the authority to do these miraculous things, then he also probably has the authority to tell us how we should live. And Matthew's argument certainly functions that way. But he might be saying even more than that. After all, disease was often thought to be the result of sin. Now, Jesus doesn't take that interpretation. That's not his view. But it was the view of people around him and occasionally the view of people in the Old Testament. More importantly, Paul would frame disease as the pathway that leads to death. And death is ultimately, indirectly or directly, the result of capital S sin. Ritual purity. Ritual purity. That's what the law is all about, right? It's about making sure that the right people are entering the presence of God and the wrong ones aren't. It's about creating boundaries around the sacredness, the holiness of God. And then, of course, demons. Well, let's make one more comment about ritual purity and impurity and the law. It is that law that when it is transgressed requires punishment, requires judgment, right? Now to the demons. Because, of course, the demons are the servants of God's enemy. And they are the enemy of all who serve God. Notice these domains of authority. These are things that the Sermon on the Mount talks about. And they deal directly with the same kinds of topics that are at the heart of the law and the prophets. Thus strengthening Matthew's argument that if Jesus has this kind of authority, then he has the authority for the Sermon on the Mount too. Right? But the way that Matthew makes his argument, the way that he tells these stories, raises another question. What kind of ministry is Jesus bringing to the world? And we really want to focus here on the last story, and especially the last verse. The people of Jesus' day, you've heard this over and over again from me and probably from every other pastor you've had. The people of Jesus' day expected a ministry of the Messiah that was coercive in nature. They expected him to come in and destroy and exclude, to drive the Romans out of Palestine and to purify, if you will, the priestly and aristocratic structures of Israel. It was supposed to be a destructive ministry. But that isn't the ministry that Jesus brings upon himself. That isn't the ministry that Jesus takes up. Jesus' ministry is a ministry of healing power. It is a ministry of service. It is a ministry of sacrifice. The way that Matthew frames this ministry, and Matthew really wants you to understand this, so he quotes Isaiah 53:4. He wants you to understand that Jesus isn't just healing our diseases in some sense that is hard for us to quite articulate. He is bearing our suffering. He is bearing our sorrow. He carries the pain of the world. Certainly, he does that because he experiences it. But perhaps there's even more to it than that. It's a different kind of ministry, isn't it? And sometimes it, just like it wasn't the ministry that they expected or maybe even wanted, it's not the ministry that we expect or want. And yes, there is a need for that kind of purifying ministry. Rachel Den Hollander rightly points to Revelation chapter 20, where Jesus' robe is dipped in blood. And I think the scholarly consensus is wrong there. It is not his own blood. There must be a day of judgment. There must be a day of reckoning. But the truth is that what most of us need more than that day of reckoning is the day of healing, a day of redemption, a day of rescue. Now, there's another question that our text raises, and it's maybe a little bit separated from these first two questions. It's kind of a new question in a sense, but in another sense, it's not a new question. Who is it that demonstrates genuine faith? You know, I said, we don't talk, Jesus doesn't talk, I should say, at all about faith in the Sermon on the Mount. And yet, he hints at the question in chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, right? When he says, look, you need to be looking for the narrow gate, the narrow road, not the wide gate and the wide road, because only the narrow gate and the narrow road leads to life. But now, in our middle story here, verses 5 through 13, Jesus makes the question of faith explicit. And it's so interesting. Who is it that we would expect to have faith? We'd expect it to be the pious people, the theologians, the seminary professors, the local priests, the pastors, the synagogue leaders, the deacons. But those are not the people who have faith, who demonstrate genuine faith. No. It's a leper, an outcast. More to the point, it's a centurion, an enemy. Now, of course, we could say, well, yeah, but these are the people who had needs. Yes, because sometimes it takes a need for us to become aware of where our faith really is. They bring their needs to Jesus. This leper is an outcast because he is ritually impure. It's not just because people saw someone with a skin disease and went, ew, yuck. Undoubtedly, that was part of it, but that wasn't all or even most of it. This man was ritually impure. He was labeled as someone who could not enter the presence of God. Now, the Old Testament has its reasons for doing these things, and maybe sometime we'll have an opportunity to come back and talk about that. But this man who cannot enter the presence of God has the foresight to know when God is at work. And he comes to Jesus. Likewise, this centurion, he is an enemy, not just because he is part of the Roman army, but because he's probably a Syrian. He's not a Roman or a Greek. He's a Syrian. He's a near neighbor to these Jews who has thrown his lot in with the Romans. And the Syrians and the Jews had been long-term competitors, adversaries, if you will. And now this guy, because he signed up with the Romans, has authority. He's an enemy. And yet he too comes to Jesus with his need. Now, I want you to notice exactly how these two people put their faith in Jesus. They do so by acknowledging his authority. We've already mentioned that this leper, and your Bible may have a note on this leprosy may or may not have been actually leprosy, but they use the Greek word that we translate leprosy for a lot of different skin diseases. But this leper, he doesn't come to Jesus and ask for help. He comes and makes a statement. If you are willing, you can make me clean. That is an astonishing statement of authority. Actually, no. Supposedly, Jesus can't at least label him clean. The priest has to do that. But what does Jesus do? Jesus says, I am willing. He reaches out his hand and cleanses the leper. Now, if you know anything about the Old Testament, you know that's not how this works. Impurity makes the pure impure. But that's not how it works with Jesus. Yeah. Jesus' purity drives out the impurity. Right? Now, that is a remarkable statement on the part of this leper. That is a statement of faith. But did you see what Jesus said about the centurion? In the immediate aftermath of this story of the leper, Jesus says about the centurion, I've never seen faith like this in all of Israel. Now, why is that? Why would he make such a laudatory statement towards this centurion? Look there at verse 7. Now, your translation, depending on which one that you're reading, might say, and Jesus said, I will come and heal him. A sentence, a declarative sentence, right? But it can also read as the NIV reads, a question. Shall I come and heal him? Now, why? How is that possible that it can be both of those things? Well, because in the Greek of Jesus' day, when they wrote down Greek manuscripts, they didn't put spaces between the words. The words were all in capital letters, and there was no punctuation. Oh, boy. Yeah. If you want to sometime, have a friend go home and have a friend or a kid or somebody write out a sentence like that just in English. Don't tell you what it is. Write it out, all capital letters, no spaces and no punctuation. See how hard it is to read. It's not easy. And so there are times when we're not certain whether there's a question or a sentence. Now, if you purchase a Greek New Testament today, scholars have put in the punctuation marks that they think are appropriate, okay? So fortunately, when you learn New Testament Greek today, you don't have to try to read it that way. And we use lowercase letters and that kind of thing. And we put spaces between the words. But when Matthew originally wrote this down, that's not what we had. And so what scholars are trying to figure out is this a question or not? If it is a question, and I think it probably is, then what Jesus is doing is he's raising an obstacle to the centurion's faith. Because, of course, Jesus is not supposed to come to his home. Now, he may not be. Some scholars suggest that Jesus is kind of looking at him side-eye going, you really want me to come to your house? I don't see that in the text. But Jesus is raising the obvious issue, the elephant in the room. Your servant's not here. Your servant's at your house. I would have to go to your house, and while I don't have a problem with that, a lot of other Jews around me would not be real crazy about me fraternizing with a centurion. The centurion is undaunted. And that's the key to understanding Jesus' statement. Jesus puts an obstacle, I think it's a small obstacle, but it's an obstacle, in the way of this centurion's faith to test him, and the centurion passes with flying colors. What does the centurion say? Hey, look, man, I'm a centurion. My life is all about authority. If you say that my servant will be healed, he'll be healed. And Jesus is just like, right answer. Go. Let it be done in accordance with your faith. Right? So you've got this outcast and this enemy who both understand something about Jesus. He has the authority to do what they need. It's astonishing. And I'm sure that it was a bit unsettling to those around Jesus. In fact, we know that it was because of some of the testimony that we receive from other Gospels. Now, when you raise this question about who really has faith, that raises the question, oh, who really belongs to the kingdom? And of course, that's a question we've already entertained too, right? Chapter 7, verses 21 through 24. But Jesus brings it up again, and he uses the centurion situation to do so. Now, notice that for Jesus, there are two options. One is you get to go to the party with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The other is you get thrown into outer darkness. Now, darkness was a metaphor for punishment, for eschatological punishment, and not just in Judaism, but also in Greek thought. Darkness is often associated with Tartarus, the Greek place of punishment, the lowest and worst part of Hades, the place of the dead. And Hades itself was mostly pretty dark, but Tartarus was much darker. Now, who gets to go to the party? Lots of people from east and west. People from all over, right? So instead of chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, where the way is narrow, now you got lots of people going, right? It's an interesting contrast. And there are going to be people from all over. But notice that phrase, but the servants of the kingdom. Now, one way you can, or the subjects of the kingdom, I should say, one way that you could interpret that is that he's talking about a different kingdom. And he's saying, those who belong to the kingdom of the devil, well, they're going to go where the devil goes. And that may be what he's saying. But another way to interpret that is that when he says the subjects of the kingdom, he's talking about the people who by all rights should be going to the feast. But because of their unbelief, they won't. And that too is consistent with what Matthew will continue to teach in his gospel. You see, the thing that we learn from these last two questions is the people who belong to the kingdom are sometimes not the people that we expect. It is sometimes a bit of a surprise. Now, how do we pull all of this together? How do we make it sort of apply to our own lives? Well, let's begin by saying this. Established religion is not a bad thing, but sometimes it leads us astray. Sometimes the misconceptions, the theological errors that we set in stone by putting them into our religious institutions actually lead us to put our faith in the wrong things. Like I said, religious organizations are good. Religious leaders are good. Doctrinal statements can be good. These can all be good things. But they can also lead us astray. Even if they're right and good, they can still lead us astray, not because they intend to, but just because we end up focusing on the wrong things. We end up putting our faith in the wrong things. We end up limiting our view of God in the wrong ways. Jesus broke the mold with his ministry. He didn't do things the way that people expected. And yet, he was doing exactly what God called him to do. May we do exactly the same thing. Let us pray.